everybody, thank you for joining today. The webinar is presented by iFind Property. It's on the topic of short-term rentals. I had the idea of doing this during a recent conversation with myself and Kenina Court, who's, wave your hand, Kenina. There she is. So Kenina is my accountant, and she's also accountant for iFind Property, and she was speaking about just the differences involved in short-term rentals versus long-term. And I remember seeing questions about property management for this and insurance for this, and folks who have done this for this. And there aren't any really good cohesive resources in New Zealand on how to do a short-term rental and just do it properly. So here we are. On the call today, we have Kenina just waved her hand. So she's an accountant and tax expert based out of Auckland. Kenina, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Hi, everybody. As Nick said, I'm an accountant, and I've been investing in property since 1999. I've done all sorts of different things. I've done REPs, I've done buy and holds, I've done build to sells, I've done rent to buys, I've done commercial, I've done quite a lot of work around that whole property side of things. So it's a personal interest of mine, and as a result, I end up with a fair few amount of property investor as clients, and which is great because I love talking about deals and how you can make them work.
Thanks, Kenina. I'm going right to left on my little boxes of squares of people at the top of the screen. So Debbie, you're next. Debbie Den Broek is a property finder with iFind Property. She lives in Rotorua. She also runs a is it a bed and breakfast or a short-term let, or is it?
It's a short-term let. I've been running it for 14 years.
Yep.
And it's won lots and lots of awards, and it makes a decent amount of money.
Yep.
And I've got that with my long-term rentals, so it's quite interesting comparing the two different business models and the differences that you need to know about. And
Batch Care, we invited Batch Care on there, and I think it's my fault that they didn't make it because I went on holiday and didn't get back to them in time. So Debbie has been in touch with a couple of property management businesses, I think, because you're planning on taking some trips. And again, so hopefully Debbie can answer some questions about costings and what you need to do to manage your property, both by yourself, because she looks after her property by herself, or self-manages, and also when you're running it through a property management business. And also on the call, we've got Chris Lane. Chris is my insurance broker. He's also Debbie's insurance broker. I'm not sure if he's Kenina's insurance broker. I don't think so. Chris is based in, not yet. Chris is based in Blenheim, and he's, I started working with him because he was one of the few people I could find who made insurance less complicated and had an had a good focus on investment properties. So Chris, welcome.
Thank you. I operate my business, First Lane Insurance. I've done insurance broking now for about 25 years. I have 5 rental properties of my own, and we have an endorsement by the Property Investors Federation for looking after rental property insurances, and have sort of learnt quite a bit about, you know, the things that are affecting rental properties in particular with meth and earthquakes, and, you know, have experienced a pretty local unpleasant earthquake as well. So seeing how that all works has been very much a learning curve, but I think pretty qualified to be able to give advice to people. So yeah.
Thanks, Chris. And just myself, I'm not, beyond staying in a few Airbnbs, I'm really not that experienced in the short-term rental market. I'm very interested in it. But I own at present 3 rental properties in central Wellington, but I've been investing for what feels like a long time now. And I'm very interested to dig into this topic. So we're going to start with Debbie. And as an owner, I think a good starting point would be to use the property that you've run for 14 years as sort of an example, and talk about what works, what hasn't worked, and dig into the conversation from there.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So I thought I'd start with Airbnb is a popular choice for people looking to make a bit of extra money from their property. The hype around Airbnb is huge, but the reality for many is not that great. With high costs, difficulty finding reliable and honest cleaning staff, and filling occupancy that falls outside that standard holiday period, and that's crucial for your cash flow and profit. I hope this webinar will help people step up and create a success from a short-term rental. So if you're listening, grab a pen and paper, because there might be some ideas that are given to you during this time. So who am I, and why listen to me? Because I don't believe in listening to people that talk and don't walk the talk. I built a minor dwelling back in 2001 for my granddad. It was a 1-bedroom, 55 square metre box. When he passed away, I evaluated the profitability of a short-term rental, because I really didn't want knuckle-dragging tenants and their oil-dripping cars parked on my driveway and their scruffy friends partying across the path. I met a lady. It was the only person that I knew who had a short-term rental, and she said the earnings was the same as if I had a standard rental. So we figured, my husband and I, since there were no knuckle draggers, less damage, no scruffy cars on our driveway and no noisy parties, we'd go down that path. So we began in January 2004. There was only 2 short-term rentals in the area, and in year 1 I made $10,400. When a standard rental of that size would have earned $5,000. Fast forward to this year, January 2017, which is year 14, the unit earned $53,000, and if it was a standard rental, it would have earned $15,000. So how can you do it? It's an excellent return on investment, but it's not without pitfalls. Airbnb is not the Exceler of wealth. It offers cheap accommodation for travellers, but it's really hard for a host advertising on the site. It's really hard to stand out from all the others and become, number one, like you can become number one on Google. Even Airbnb super hosts, they get a name if they've had lots of reviews, look around for other ways to market their property, especially in the shoulder seasons and the off season. I'd have to say Airbnb is probably my least possible site to be situated on, but there's lots of others that can make good money. So the benefit of a short-term let is there's no tenants, there's less damage, there's much more money that you can possibly earn, and there's less wear and tear. But the downfalls are the costs of having a property manager do it for you are much higher than a normal property manager. If you are arranging your own cleaners, good cleaners don't pay tax. Sorry, Kenina. All the money you pay your cleaner is usually under the table, and so it comes off your bottom line. They can be unreliable, they can have accidents. So if you are doing a short-term let and trying to manage it yourself, just think what happens on New Year's Day when they say, I've just broken my leg and I can't clean for the next 6 months. And if you're working in Auckland, how do you get that house cleaned ready for the people that have paid lots of money to come and stay for a week? Because there'll be no other accommodation available. So it's just something you need to consider. Setup costs are a bit higher because you need to present your property as it is brand new. You don't have stained carpets, you don't have old benches. You really need to make it a high-spec place like you'd expect from a hotel. And one bad review will destroy your business. 2 is just deadly. And the dreaded pubic hair is what every person that runs a short-term let, they pop up everywhere. Benches, sinks, behind curtains. You've really got to be very fastidious looking for those hiding little bits and pieces. The other thing, if you are managing a property that isn't nearby your own home, is the issue with meth and parties. A lot of the people that cook methamphetamine now look for short-term lets as a place to do their cooking. They're very hard to trace when they've left, and not many people do meth testing between rentals because it would cost you an arm and a leg. So you've got to be really careful if you are trying to self-manage and you're a long distance away and your little fingers are wiggling.
Yeah, because I just want to jump over to Chris about this, because this is a specific question I asked Chris coming into this, was how do insurers look at short-term rentals for methamphetamine? Because this is it's a big issue in regular tenancies, but I imagine it's even more complicated for these types of properties. So Chris.
All right, you'd like me to get into that now?
Get into that now.
Okay, so short-term tenancies do have, it depends on how you've got the cover structured. So if, for example, as in Debbie's case, you've got a property which is solely set up for short-term rentals and there's no intent to use it yourself as a holiday home, say for example, because there's a whole mixture of Airbnbs where you could have just one room of a house, or you could use it as an Airbnb while you're not using it, or otherwise you could use it solely. So if you're in that latter situation where it's solely set up for short-term accommodation for other people, you would probably have to insure it commercially. And if you insure it commercially, the policy should be okay. It depends a lot on how much information you disclose to the insurers. But if you are using it as a holiday home and you've got it insured domestically, then a lot of the insurers will have restrictions on the policy where they won't cover damage if it's short-term accommodation. So there's a lot of variation in policies, and you need to read that really carefully, because it may be that there's a requirement for that cover to apply. You must have a regular residential tenancy agreement in place, or you have to be in there for longer than 90 days, depends on the insurer. But insurers have cottoned on to the fact that these properties are being targeted for meth labs, and so therefore there are clauses in the policy that can really restrict whether or not cover will apply. So you need to be very careful in this area.
Thanks, Chris. So sorry, Debbie, to interrupt you with a bit
No,
of
that's
delay.
good. That's excellent.
We'll jump back over. Chris, we'll come back to you on differences with policies and costs and what the excesses are, etc. And I think, Debbie, you're about to talk about partying.
Talk about what parties?
People having parties at your property.
Oh, they don't have mine.
No.
They don't have mine.
Well, you've got a police officer on premises, don't you?
Yes, I have. And there's no methamphetamine either.
Could I ask Debbie a question?
Go ahead.
How do you check for signs of people who you're wary of perhaps setting up a meth lab if you're renting it out to them? Like, what do you look for?
You can't. I mean, I can because I'm here and I see them. But it's just who makes a booking, an email from an odd place that don't give their name, their address, don't want to pay in cash. A lot of the good websites like Book a Batch, and I've got a list of them a bit further on, they trace, booking.com, they'll trace where these people have come from. But we do occasionally get the odd email from someone that's perhaps seen a website or coming wanting to pay cash. They're a little bit unusual, not like your usual traveller. There's sort of warning bells.
Turn them away?
We would turn them away.
Turn them away, or yeah.
I probably don't have to because I'm here, and your chances of cooking pee under my nose is pretty slim. But if I was in Auckland and had a house in Queenstown, I'd be a little bit more cautious about who I let into my investment.
Yeah.
Airbnb, something that's got members where they can track down where the people have come from. But yeah, there's nothing beats scoping them out with your eyes.
Yeah. Do the you recently talked, I think, to Batch Care and maybe some others. Do they talk about how they screen for tenants?
No, they don't really say how they screen. They most of these property managers advertise on a place called Book a Batch, which is actually is a little bit more. You sort of got to join, and you can't be quite as nebulous as like Booking.com. Give a false email address. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just a little, yeah. Probably using a property manager is easier than trying to do it yourself and just having someone email you out of the ether that you have no, yeah. Just like tenants, sometimes they lie.
So let's talk a little bit about the location. So you've done very well out of your property over the years. When you talk to folks about setting up a short-term rental, what kind of locations do you think work and potentially don't work?
I think you should really buy in a tourist area or somewhere where holiday makers want to stay.
Yeah.
Perhaps you look at the sort of customer you want to attract. You know, do you want to attract mountain bikers? Is it near a mountain bike trail? Trampers, near some, you know, like the Tararua Forest, skiers, beachgoers, or close to the main tourist attractions that attract international guests. And that will dictate how big your season will be. So if it's a beach, your main income will come over Christmas, New Year, and it will be fairly quiet from, you know, the winter. Skiers, it's the opposite. If you go to a tourist attraction, you'll actually find you can get a longer season and less downtime. So like your Rotoruas, your perhaps Hawke's Bays, the Marlborough area, somewhere where tourists sort of track on their travels around New Zealand will just give you a greater chance of making a bigger profit. So once you've chosen your area, you probably want to do a bit of market research and see how many competitors you've got in the short-term letting field, what sort of price they're paying, and certainly don't aim to be cheap, because cheap places attract cheap people staying, more likely having meth. And a lot of people, if it's too cheap, they think, what's wrong with it? So just check out the prices in the area and how you can make your purchase stand out and be number one in that area. And it's really important because you can buy a house and guests won't come. You've really got to market it. So as an income goal, if you're doing 10 to 20 nights a year, you're not doing very well. The average appears to be, when I've talked to other operators, is 100 to 140 nights per year, which should give you twice the rental income of a standard rental. And if you're getting 190 plus, you're doing really, really well.
Right.
So profitability, if with a standard rental, you've got to pay rent, insurance rates and insurance. And a short-term net will earn you more money, but you not only have those three things, but you've also got to pay for cleaning, power, internet, water, your laundry, and a property manager. So there's a lot of extra costs. Although it looks great earning twice as much as a standard rental, you really want to make it bigger than that because your costs are much, much more.
Do you mind me asking what your costs are as a percentage of the rent?
Of me? So just roughly, I usually pay 10% commission, 4% advertising, 4% laundry, 3% insurance, 3% for power, 2% for rates, and about 6% for cleaning. That ramps up considerably, so I would suggest if you're doing it, you have a minimum 2-night stay, because that will change. I'm just going to do my profitability for somewhere. On a 1-night stay, 51% of my earnings go in costs.
Yeah.
If I double it to 2 nights, it's 63% is profit, and if I go to 4 nights and longer, it's 71% profit. So changing from 1 night to 2 nights certainly makes things much more worthwhile. So yeah, try. Yeah, if you buy a property in an area, aim for longer stays. Don't do one nights; it'll cost you a fortune.
Yeah.
When you're marketing your property, you really want to think what makes it different. So buying, a house in the suburbs isn't going to do as well as something by a beach, beachfront or lakefront or river edge, So you've got to work out for yourself, what's your point of difference? Is it a view? Is it mountain bike trail, bush, and advertise for that? And then when you're doing your photographs, you don't just take a picture of your house. People want to see what they'd be doing in the house. So when I first did my advertising, I had a picture of my little box house. And my sister said to me, they want to see the sheep. Asians love the sheep. So we parked all the sheep in front of the house so people could actually see a bit of what they get. Towels on bed, wine glasses on, outdoor tables. So yeah, your ideas for your photos need to be what that guest will be doing when they really stay at your little house.
Tourism marketing rather than accommodation. Well,
absolutely. Yeah. Because you have to stand out from, if you look at Airbnb, it's just all these rooms, nothing special. And so, scroll through all those sites and check what other operators are doing and pinch their ideas, pinch their wording if you're not creative, because that's certainly what I did, and then create your own advert. So I just thought I'd give, Airbnb is the media darling. It's not probably for income. Most people that have got short-term lets that they don't live in the same town use both Airbnb and Book a Batch, and the income seems to come 50-50 from each of them. Airbnb, I've found, attracts the cheaper guest. They're always looking for a budget room, and you really don't want to be marketing yourself in the budget room department. So Airbnb and Book a Batch you can run as a tandem, and you don't have to pay any. Book a Batch you pay by the night, so you're not upfront for any advertising.
Okay.
But there are other places that are free. There's booking.com, Delta, Agoda, Expedia you can advertise on. Try and get a listing on TripAdvisor. If you set yourself up a little website, you can get it done for about $300. Really good to collect reviews, and you're not paying for advertising. Don't pay for advertising on TripAdvisor. Holiday Houses is a Trade Me site that does short-term properties. There's Pure New Zealand, which is a free Tourism New Zealand advertising website that you can register on. And then a website called Book It, not booking.com. And all the local tourism sites use Book It for their inventory. So it's another way of getting some free marketing. I pay for only two companies to advertise my product, and that's New Zealand Online. And they do a fantastic job, and True New Zealand. And you can put your place on Google Maps for free. So there's lots of free places that you can advertise apart from just Airbnb, because I think your income won't be so great if you do that. And don't pay for advertising in paper, like magazines, because it's a waste of money. And perhaps offer a local school. Local school, a free night. Just do that. Editorials in the paper. Anything you do to get some free marketing. And that's about me, I think.
Do you do anything along the lines of getting together a bunch of information, like brochures about local activities? Like, you sometimes see in hotels where there's a pamphlet with, like, here's where you can go and do boating or kayaking. I'm thinking about Rotorua or mountain biking.
Yeah, definitely go to your local eyesight, collect all the brochures, and I've got a brochure rack with all the things you can do. I've done a folder with what to do when it's raining, all hints and tips about what to do in the city, little things that are perhaps free that people visiting don't know what to do, good restaurants.
Map to the supermarket.
Yes, and churches.
Oh.
People like to know where churches are.
You're mapped to the church.
No.
Just tell them. Okay.
Yeah. So short-term property management, I've spoken to companies that do it. They usually charge between 15 and 20% of the gross nightly rental, plus linen costs, plus cleaning.
Okay.
They ask the guests to clean themselves, but talking to other operators, guests don't clean themselves very well. And you're usually paid after a person stayed. The company I spoke to was called Two Lakes Holiday Rentals, but there is also Batch Care that will manage the whole lot for you. They said they tried Airbnb, but it wasn't successful as a marketing exercise because it was too hard to get noticed. And they use exclusively Book a Batch in their marketing. But it is an option and a safer option than trying to do it yourself and getting caught during a holiday period with no one to clean. So, yeah.
So, I mean, the key thing there would be if your cleaner pulls a sickie on New Year's Day, and you're under batch care, it's their problem to fix, not your problem to fix.
Yes.
Wherever you take it up with your family.
Yeah, or you get Christmas Eve and they go, oh, we're going away for 3 weeks, and it's one of those oh bugger moments.
Yeah.
But if you get a good cleaner, your profit goes through the roof because they can do all your little bits and bobs and take a pride in what they're doing.
Does your cleaner replace things like milk or any
Yes, if I go away, my cleaner will do everything. She'll put the food in, she'll take the laundry to the laundromat, absolutely everything. She'll even feed my animals. But not all cleaners are like that. I love her.
I can imagine that you'd be taking good care of her, wouldn't you? She'd get a good Christmas present.
She gets lovely gifts.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Lovely things. So I think just if you are starting a short-term let, there's a few resources that can increase your profitability. There's a company called Commercial Supplies in Wellington, which does all your hospitality supplies like linen, pillows. Smelly pillows are a hate with travellers, and they get smelly really quickly. You can, with your linen, you can hire it and then take it back, and they give you a new set, so you don't have to own your own linen. Or else you can buy your linen and then send it out to get laundered, because I don't think there's anything worse than ironing sheets. With the linen, I found a lot of people get duvets and duvet covers. They cost a lot to launder. And bedspreads, I mean, they're in lovely little motels we use bedspreads, but they cost about $15 to clean. So before you lie on that hotel bedspread, just think, no one pays $15 to clean that bedspread between you. So we use a process called triple sheeting, which is a box duvet cover that you get from Commercial Supplies, and it has a decorative sheet that you can clean for next to nothing. So we can guarantee that there's not stains and other matter on top of our beds. So it saves a lot of money with your laundry, because your laundry is a big cost if you are running a short-term let. And yeah, that's about all from me.
Cool, thanks.
Have you got any questions?
One question came in, and I don't know that you're going to have the answer for it, but Michael asked any particular sites you would recommend for short-term renting of city apartments.
City apartments?
I know you love Auckland, so. No,
I do. I think you book a batch.
Yeah.
Your Airbnb, just if your booking.com, Agoda, holiday houses, anything. An apartment is a little house. So I've got a list of free sites, but they're probably the better ones that actually bring in bookings.
We'll send that out in the email summary. I mean, I rent places, Airbnb. Simply, I mean, I wind up using Airbnb because they've already verified me, so I just log in and I'm a trusted person. I haven't tried the other ones, but it'll be interesting to hear from someone in Auckland and Wellington perhaps who has done the strategy successfully in the city and managed to stand out, because there's a lot more properties in the confined area, I think, and more coming online with more apartments. It seems like a much more competitive sort of price-driven market, but I'm not sure. Let's move on to Kenina Court, who's waited very patiently. And Kenina, we had a fascinating discussion, and it's really hard to make tax into a fascinating discussion, but you did a great job. So, particularly around, I had a couple of questions come in first around chattels and depreciation and differences there, but let's talk first about structures and how you should structure, if there's any difference in how you should structure and set up the entity to hold a short-term rental versus a regular rental property.
Okay. Hi everybody. I think the first thing that people need to get their heads around is that short-term rentals and long-term rentals are treated differently from the point of view of GST. If your rental is earning less than $60,000 a year, we don't need to worry about GST on a short-term rental. If you're talking long-term rentals, it doesn't matter how much your property earns, GST is irrelevant. However, if your short-term rental goes over $60,000, GST automatically kicks in. Now, a lot of people are doing over $60,000 and not even realizing that they've actually moved themselves from outside of the GST net to inside the GST net, and this can have devastating consequences. For example, let's say that you have a property that's worth, say, I'll keep the numbers easy, and because I'm in Auckland, $1.15 million. Okay, and you've been renting that out on a short-term rental. You've just started, it's your first year, and in your first year, you've only made, say, $30,000. Next, you go into your second year. Now, in your second year, because you've now had the property for a whole year, the property is now turning over about $80,000. Well, as soon as you do that, you trip the GST net. So now you have to pay GST on all of your income in total up to the $90,000. It's not just on the bit that's over $60,000. It's not on a per rental property. It's the total income. Now, the devastating thing about that is if you go to sell that property and you haven't structured yourself properly from a GST point of view, and let's say you sell your property now a couple of years down the track and it's worth $1.5 million. Did you know that you now have to pay GST on that $1.5 million? You just lost $300,000. Now, that's pretty difficult to recover from, especially if you weren't budgeting for that first thing up. So the structure that you use to do your short-term rentals is even more important than the structure that you might choose for your long-term rentals. So if you think that you're going to go over $60,000, then the fix to get around this is actually quite simple. You can have a long-term buy and hold entity to own the property. You then set up a company, which is a company that does the short-term letting, and it rents the property from your entity that owns it. So the rent on the property might be, for argument's sake, $400 a week. So your short-term renting company pays $400 a week. The short-term renting company then can rent that $400 a week property out for whatever it wants. It could rent it out for just $400 a week, or it could rent it out and say that actually you could rent this property for $300 a night, and that property at $300 a night is going to generate, in round terms, let's say $1,000 a week. So that $1,000 a week from a short-term renting point of view, we're under $60,000, so we don't have to worry about GST. But if we go over $60,000, and we are therefore required to be registered for GST, at that point, it's only the company that's doing the short-term letting that actually has to register for GST. The entity that owns your property still is doing that on a long-term rental basis. So effectively, you end up with two entities, one that does the actual long-term buy and hold, and then one that does the short-term renting. So what goes through the short-term renting are all the expenses, a lot of them that Debbie talked about in terms of the cleaner, although my recommendation is that you do that above the table, not below the table. One of the things that people forget, just as an aside on that, is actually what IR do with all of the data that comes into them when people do their tax returns. So they'll work out that short-term rentals have all of these costs. And if you are glaringly obvious that you don't have any cleaning costs, IRD could come knocking on your door to figure out what it is that you do in terms of your cleaning. If you've advertised on Book a Batch or Airbnb and said that you include a cleaning fee in there, they're going to want to know, what do you do with that cleaning fee? Because you'll have declared it, because that's the income coming in, and everybody can see that. But how you spend it, not very many people can see that part of it. So if you end up with no cleaning cost, you might just get a phone call from Inland Revenue to figure out why you don't have a cleaning cost when they have all of these other owners that have cleaning costs. You'd be surprised at how deep their pockets can go for putting money into finding this stuff out. So you can put your cleaning through that. If you do Sky, if you, one of the questions that we got asked was, can you buy things like bikes and kayaks to have in the property so that people can use them? It's part of being able to attract people to a tourist destination as opposed to just an accommodation destination. And absolutely you can do that and then depreciate those at the appropriate rates, and if you're registered for GST, claim back the GST on however much it costs for those items. The things that you can't put through that entity would be the things that you normally, as a long-term buy and hold landlord, have to pay. So you have to cover your own insurance, you have to cover your own rates. You can pass water rates through the short-term entity because under our law you're allowed to have an agreement with tenants that they pass the rates. Now, on a short-term lenting point of view, you're not going to say to your the people staying in your property, you're not going to say, okay, so I'm charging you $300 and of that $250 is for the accommodation and $20 is for this and $15 is for that and $10 is for this. No, it's just an all-in-one inclusive price. But just because you charge it out on an all-in-one inclusive price doesn't mean that you can't claim the various costs that go into making that up. When the time comes, that maybe down the track you want to sell the property, you're selling out of the long-term buy and hold entity, which will sell the property, not have any GST implications, no capital gains tax, assuming that you have bought it within the strictures of long-term buy and hold, and very simple and straightforward. The entity that was running the short-term rentals, that entity, you'll just eventually close it down because it never actually owned any assets. So it'll be simple to close it down. You'll obviously have to sell off things like the bikes and the kayaks and the beds, and the Sally Army might do very well out of all of the bed linen that you might have, or whatever it might be. But it's very easy to then go through the process of closing that entity down, and you have no GST implications on the sale of your property. That's the big kicker. I dealt with a client last year who had bought a property as a residential property, turned around, started renting it out on a short-term basis, went over $60,000 very quickly, sold it last year, and between her and her lawyer, they managed to stuff up the GST side of things. And so her property, which she did sell for about $1.8 million, she lost 15% on that, which was never part of what she budgeted for.
Ouch.
Yes.
That's right.
Tell me about it. Can't insure for that.
No.
I have a question on this, just on the GST thing. So, and it's a comment that I think Debbie mentioned to me once, where it's not Is it when you pass that $60,000 threshold, or is it when your annual run rate looks like it's going to go over that $60,000 threshold that GST kicks in?
You have to register for GST as soon as you think you're going to go over the $60,000, and bear in mind it's not on a per property basis. It is what is the entity that owns the property or owns the income stream, what is that going to do on a per annum basis? So if you had, say for example, 2 short-term rentals that were doing 25,000, and then all of a sudden the area that they were in became really popular and they went up, it doesn't matter that the 2 properties individually might only go up by $10,000, so that now it's $35,000 each. The fact is that the entity now is more than $60,000.
So, and one other question is that would seem to be an indication that you should have 1 entity per property. Or
well, I'm the
is
big
that something the IRD looks at that? Does the IRD
It's a win for the accountant if you do that. I don't know that I would necessarily recommend that. The structure that I would choose to do would be to have all the rental properties on a long-term buy and hold basis with no GST implications, owned in a trust, and then all of your short-term rentals to be dealt with through a separate company.
Would you have 1 separate company or multiple? So if I've got 2 properties or 3 properties who are doing nicely $50,000 each, it would seem to be cheaper to have them from a tax perspective in 3 separate companies to avoid GST on all 3. Or does the IRD look at that as sort of tax avoidance?
No. As long as you set yourself up properly from day one, IRD won't question why you chose to do things in a particular way. Okay. But if you put everything into a single entity and then separated it out because you realised that you were going to trigger GST, then that would become a problem. Okay. So I don't know. I guess I'm torn from that point of view because it sounds like a good idea to start off with, to save that from a GST point of view, have everything in separate entities. But the difficulty is that you then have to run 3 Sky accounts. You have to run 3 lawnmower men. You have to run, so you can't, so now you have, you might have saved GST, but your time to administer all of that just tripled as well.
3 bank accounts.
3 bank accounts, 3 companies, 3 sets of accounting fees, 3 lots of insurances, 3 lots of property management fees. The list just goes on.
So every 3 separate lending accounts with these people in Christchurch, and they'll have you with different account managers because it's 3 accounts. Okay.
Can I butt in? Can I butt in? I mean, you're going to have your 3 sets of property manager fees coming in for 3 properties. It's not going to save you anything. But the difference between your profit at 59,000 and at 61,000 is huge. Because you suddenly.
I agree. So you really need to be making sure that you're going to hit about $75,000 in gross revenue to actually make it worthwhile.
And it's a once you go over that number, then that's it going forward, isn't it? It's every year from there on out. So if you make 75,000 one year, then you're back to 60 the next year.
You can't exit and enter the GST regime just when it suits you. Once you're in, you're in.
I have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm just going to read these out. So Vass has asked, is there any input credit for GST if you trigger GST registration?
There is, but only if it's within 2 years of purchasing the asset. Right? So if it takes you 4 years to trigger the GST threshold, basically you're stuffed. You can no longer claim GST on the purchase price of the property.
This makes sense. And Gillian has said, when you mention the GST output payable, you could also claim the input tax.
Yeah, so what I think what Gillian is referring to there is, yes, you have to pay GST on the revenue that you've received, but actually you also get to claim the GST that you've paid on the Sky, on the cleaners, assuming you pay them above the table, the lawnmower man, the guy who might come to clean the chimneys. All of those expenses that you previously couldn't claim GST on, you now get to claim the GST on. So that offsets some of the cost that you incur, if you like, in terms of less cash flow by having to register for GST.
I mean, if Debbie said her average profit margin sounds like it's between 30 and 45%. So your GST is on your what effectively you're paying is 15% of your net profit, isn't it? So 30 to 40, 50 to 70% of 60,000 or 80,000, what have you.
I think the easiest way to work it out is if you were rented for $365 a night, 365 nights a year at X dollars, work out what your maximum profit or income could ever be. And if it's only going to be 75,000, then try and stick below. But if it's 200,000, then there's a good chance if you're doing well, you will trip over that 60,000.
Yeah, and that's not a bad thing. You'll make a lot more than $9,900 if you're making 200,000 and paying GST.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kenina. Awesome. Any other questions? Just pop them in the chat. We're going to move on to Chris because I'm sort of conscious of time here. Chris, you've probably got the trickiest questions. I'll save you to last because insurance is always fun. And now we're talking about having a landlord who Debbie owns the house, or Debbie's trust owns the house, and then a commercial entity set up to run the short-term rentals on that. And we just talked before about having commercial insurance. How would you structure something to take care of this?
For Debbie's particular case?
For the scenario that Kenina just put forward as having a long-term rental is what the landowner has, and she leases it to a business at a certain amount per week on standard residential lease, then that business turns around and runs a commercial operation.
Yeah, so you can still have multiple entities listed on one insurance policy. Effectively, if you owned both companies, so the shareholders or the beneficiaries of a trust were consistent, then most insurance companies would be able to deal with that on one policy. So it might be that you nominate the trust as the building owner or the landlord, perhaps, and then the company that does the trading or the actual renting itself is listed as the short-term, listed as another insured for the purposes of the occupation of the property. And as long as you really explain that to the insurers, I can't see that there'll be any major issue with that. Yeah.
And on the commercial insurance side of things, because this will be new for most investors, how does that differ from a regular residential insurance policy in terms of what the costs are and the obligations and what is covered?
Yeah, so that's probably pretty important. The main issue is around the concept of the cover that's provided by the EQC. So in order for you to buy a domestic policy in New Zealand, all domestic insurers will rely on the fact that there needs to be EQC cover. So if there can't be EQC cover, they won't provide domestic cover. If you've got a house which you live in and you rent out one room for short-term accommodation, as long as you've disclosed that to your insurance company and they are happy with that, then you can still insure that under a domestic policy. If you've got your own holiday home and you use it for the great times you want to use it, but for the rest of the year you rent that out to short-term users, you will typically find that that is also okay to be insured as a domestic policy. However, where you trip up is if you've got a property where under the EQC, the legislation is doubtful. And so under the EQC Act, and if you go onto their website, you can see how they describe when cover does and doesn't apply. But there needs to, be the ability for the owner to use it as a holiday home, and also intent. So if you have intent to use it, even if it's only one weekend a year, then that should be okay, as long as, again, you've explained fully to the insurer the nature of the use. They should be able to insure that as a domestic policy. However, if there isn't any intent, or you can't really provide anything that would support the intent to use it yourself, then immediately you've got a problem, because the insurance company aren't going to want to cover it if after a claim the EQC turn around and determine that, oh no, this wasn't a residential property, it was a commercial property, and therefore cover doesn't apply. So you need to really hammer all that out up front very, very carefully. So if you're in that situation, you own a home which is rented out solely for short-term accommodation, you really, in order to be totally safe, must insure that commercially. Unfortunately, the costs of that do go up. You have a whole different reinsurance structure behind all the insurers that determine what the charges are. So you find that there's a lot more variation in prices between earthquake-prone zones. So the price of insurance in Wellington, Christchurch, Marlborough will be a lot more than each end of the country. You also find that the price will vary considerably depending on what the property is made of and how old it is. Old wooden buildings in earthquake zones cost an awful lot more than nice concrete brand new buildings in Southland or Northland. You'll also find that there are a number of insurers who will apply a minimum premium, whereas you'll find that that's just they pitch the whole premium structure higher, and because the EQC's rate of earthquake charges is exactly the same right across the whole country, the first 100,000 of cover that they provide means that the insurers effectively have $100,000 excess for earthquake damage, and so they can always take that out, and that reduces their costs significantly. So effectively why the costs are a lot flatter, if you like, across the regions than what they are commercially. You also
can I just
yeah.
Sorry, can I just jump in there, Chris? Because
Sure.
I think you bring up a good point about the commercial side of it. What I have also had happen with 2 clients just recently is that the council have turned around and said, if you're using this house commercially, we actually need to charge you commercial rates.
Yes.
Right now, commercial rates on a property are significantly higher than residential rates on a property. So there's just another thing to bear in mind, because as you start moving into that whole thing around commercial, my guess is that the councils, who are always cash strapped and looking for money, they're probably going to be looking at things like, well, how do you insure the property in order to be able to decide whether or not you should be on residential or commercial rates? And if you insure the property on commercial rates, because actually that's the only way you're going to get the right cover, then that might just open you up to something else. So
yep.
As I said, coincidentally, I've had that just happen with 2 clients just in the last couple of months, where they've had approaches from the council about just that.
I know that our local council actually looks at eyesites and travel websites, and if they see your property advertised, then you'll get hit with in Marlborough anyway, you'll get hit with a tourism levy for short-term accommodation. It's not quite full-blown commercial rates, but they actually go trawling through websites looking for properties along those lines. So yeah, you do have to be careful.
Imagine having that as your job.
It won't necessarily yes. That won't necessarily impact on exactly the insurance policy you need to have. It's really more about the transparency of disclosing exactly how it's used to the insurer, and you can determine it all on a case-by-case basis. But certainly the costs of insuring commercially are typically significantly more than the costs of insuring domestically. You also have different excess levels, so you'll find that there's higher excesses for things like theft and burglary damages as opposed to just regular domestic claims. You can choose excess levels as well, which can help with the premium. So the higher the excess, the lower the premium. But that's a lot more noticeable for domestic policies. The other thing, what was I going to say, is that within a domestic policy, you'll find that there's cover on the house. There's also cover for the loss of rents. There's also cover for liability. Whereas on a commercial policy, you do need to buy all of those things separately. So you'd have a material damage policy for the property, the building itself, and the chattels. Then you'd have a separate consequential or business interruption policy for the lost rent. And then thirdly, liability cover for you as the property owner or the manager even. You would need to have a separate liability policy to protect that. So then you start finding some of those policies will also have minimum premiums, and that can also ramp up the costs, unfortunately.
And probably one thing, I'm sure you found it before, Chris, is that people think, I'll save myself the money, we'll just go domestic, we won't do commercial, and then an event occurs. And obviously from the insurance company's point of view, as much as they want to support you, they're also looking to see, is there anything that you've done to invalidate a claim? And using a commercial property, using a residential property and claiming domestic insurance when the actual use of it has been commercial, I've had 2 clients who have had claims turned down because of that, and it was devastating because it meant that the property wasn't covered at all. One of them wasn't even one of them was actually, it was just a 7-room house, but because there were 7 rooms and everybody in the house was renting separately, the insurance company deemed that a boarding house and therefore commercial, so that the commercial policy, the domestic policy they had, didn't cover it. So therefore they had no cover for the damage that was done to their property. Yep,
may as well throw your money down the toilet.
Absolutely.
It's all just about disclosure. So it's really getting the story right, fully explaining. It might not necessarily help what you have to pay if you're truthful, but good, honest insurance, weird as that sounds, is still always the best way of applying for insurance. Full explanations all the way through, and if it changes, if you buy a property and say you were living in it and then you start renting it out and then you start renting it out short term, each of those steps you need to tell the insurer and explain exactly what's happening. And if the insurance company themselves are struggling with that because they're limited with what they can do, if it's a direct insurer, AA, AMI, state, then, I'd probably recommend that you use a broker, and they have a lot more access to, a wider variety of markets, particularly commercial insurers that can provide you with those broader options.
And here's a plug for, I think for you in general, Chris, is that I think that everybody should use an insurance broker, because exactly what you were saying about honesty is the best policy. I think the best thing that people can do is disclose everything to the insurance broker. And then the insurance broker then has the information to be able to work out what is the best way to go. So some of the information that you might tell an insurer who would then go, oh, I'm not so sure about that, in the overall context of things might be irrelevant, and your broker will know that, but they'll also know what's important, such that if there was a claim down the track, what's going to not hurt you or hurt you by disclosing that information.
I think too, sometimes when you're talking with an insurer, they're quite happy to sell you their product off the shelf. Whereas if you sit down and explain your story to a broker, they can actually interpret that and say, okay, well, this product will work better for you than that product. And therefore that will actually also influence what insurer we look at using.
Got a couple of questions for you, Chris. First one, what about a minor dwelling? If the house, we'll just use Debbie's property, for example. So she lives in the house, there's a minor dwelling on the property. Under the same residential insurance policy, or would potentially one be commercial because she's not going to live in it?
Correct.
And one residential?
Yes, so it's the use more than the entity, although I think in Debbie's case the entity is different, so we have insured that minor dwelling as a commercial policy, but it's more the fact that it's the the nature of the occupation that will determine how the insurance should work. In the same way, you have a family with a number of cars. One of the cars, the young 18-year-old is the main driver. It doesn't matter who owns them, it's who uses them that determines how the vehicle should be rated for insurance purposes. So it's the same concept. Yeah.
Next question. If you have a short-term let, and I know this, I've had this actually, I had a long-term vacancy once and something got stolen and I wasn't covered. Is the property insured when it's vacant, if it's a short-term rental?
Yes, if it depends again on how you've disclosed it and how it's managed. So if you live on site and the insurance company know that you go straight into the property after the person's left to check them, that shouldn't be a major problem. If you're living in another city and you only check on it once every couple of years and you don't have anyone else managing it, then chances are slim that you'll get that covered properly. There isn't necessarily, for a commercial policy, there isn't an unoccupancy clause like there is for a residential property. So using a comparative example, if you've got a standard residential rental property with a family in it long term, if they leave and your property is then vacant, then that policy is bound to have some kind of time restriction on how long it can be vacant for. A commercial won't necessarily, but it will default back to what becomes material. So what sort of information would you need to disclose to an insurer that would alter the way they think about the risk? So if the insurance company was going to say, well, if we'd known that it was going to be empty for 2 months, then straight away, that's something that you should have told them. The trick is that they don't need to decide if it is material or isn't material. It's just they need to have the potential for that to have influenced the way they think about the risk. So when in doubt, tell them. But yeah, if it's only a couple of days in between each one, you've got someone that checks it, you've got a cleaner that comes in regularly, I would not perceive that to be material, and so you should be fine.
All right, one last question, Chris, and I think we'll wrap this up because we're a bit over time. And I think I touched on this at the start, but Dan's asked it again. So with residential tenancies, there's a responsibility for a landlord to check for meth between tenancies to ensure the safety of the future tenants. What do insurance companies consider sufficient to satisfy this requirement? And I guess this goes for a residential policy as well as a commercial policy, because you could be on one or the other with a short-term let.
Yeah, it's tricky because this is a topic that's moving so fast, and there's new issues and problems coming up more and more and more. And I think, to be fair, our insurance industry is struggling to keep up a little bit. The interpretation of problems into how they treat claims is moving very, very quickly. So as it stands right now, there isn't necessarily a requirement for landlords to check in between every single tenancy. I imagine that will probably crop up at some stage. I think it would be a bit brutal to ask for that between short-term tenancies. There's certainly never been a requirement for that on places like motels, but you could extrapolate that out for a property that's used solely for Airbnb or short-term use. It's really just a small motel. I don't think that will come in immediately, but it just depends on how claims track. So it's really just, again, good common sense, prudent risk management. So Debbie has really good, habits of eyeballing people that come to use the property, perhaps checking out some of their background and their history. I think those are very fair and sensible requirements. And there aren't any policies that I'm aware of that actually require you to do a meth test just at this stage before you can have cover. You'll find under other residential rental policies that there are a number of obligations to do with the frequency of how often you need to inspect the property, as well as keeping an eye on the rent, as well as being able to prove that you have reference checked a tenant, although they tend to be a little bit more for long-term rentals than short-term rentals. So you're not going to be able to reference check every single short-term guest. So yeah, does that answer that?
I think that answers as well as you can right now, and that it's such a changing, shifting target with new standards just being released, I believe, a month and a half ago. Look, thanks everybody. Well, I think we'll wrap everything up now. I plan on having a bit of an open question answer time, but we've already gone 10 minutes over. So I just want to thank Chris. We're going to do a wave when we thank you. Kenina and Debbie. I'll put up a transcript of this and the video on YouTube. I'll send out with some notes and contact details of all of our lovely attendants. And again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good stuff. Thank you. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.